I'm Frank Sesno in Washington. The President, the Congress, the budget. Will there be a deficit deal? And by the way, has Judge Douglas Ginsburg been unfairly judged? We'll talk about that today with House Majority Leader Thomas Foley. He's chairman of the Budget Summit Negotiating Committee. And we'll talk with two people who know the budget process well, former Congressman James Jones and former Deputy Treasury Secretary Richard Darman. All this today on Newsmaker Saturday.
Newsmaker Saturday. A look at key issues affecting you and the nation. Bringing you face to face with the people who make the news. The Newsmakers. Live from our CNN bureau in Washington. Newsmaker Saturday.
As Wall Street completed another turbulent week, budget negotiators from Congress and the White House reported progress, but still no deal in their bid to cut the deficit in ways that will soothe battered financial markets. Proposals and counterproposals are on the table. Taxes, defense, and spending cuts. Negotiators have even considered putting the brakes on cost of living adjustments, including Social Security, to save the needed billions. Negotiators would like to take a big chunk out of the deficit, but they are still at odds over how. The chairman of the committee says even if only the minimum, $23 billion as mandated by the Gramm-Rudman budget law, is achieved, it will be a step in the right direction.
If there is a political cooperation, a bipartisan agreement between the Congress and the President to do that much at least, if not more, I think that'll be an important signal to the markets that the long sort of budget war may be easing a bit, and we may get a cooperative and bipartisan agreement to proceed further.
The world is watching and waiting. Currency markets were jolted by word that the administration has shifted priorities and is now pursuing policies to stave off recession. Treasury Secretary James Baker says interest rates must be kept down, even at the risk of a lower dollar and higher inflation. But the most important signal Washington could send right now is real agreement to make significant inroads into the deficit. We'll see how it's going, talk about what's at stake, and discuss Judge Ginsburg when we return right after this. And welcome back to Newsmaker Saturday. Joining us today from our studios in New York, Congressman Thomas Foley, House Majority Leader. Congressman, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
Congressman, before we turn to what is your paramount concern and the primary topic of our conversation today, which is the budget and these negotiations to hammer out a deficit deal, I would like to ask you about what is going on with Judge Ginsburg, and I would like to note, of course, that being on the House side, it is not your side of the Congress that confirms him. That, of course, belongs in the Senate. Nonetheless, your views as House Majority Leader, I think, would be of great interest. Is this man, because of admitted occasional uses of marijuana and some other things, do you feel being railroaded?
Well, I wouldn't say it's being railroaded, but I hope that the nomination can be judged on Judge Ginsburg's legal abilities and his judicial, I should say, philosophy, rather than this issue of an occasional past use of marijuana. I agree with President Reagan that should not determine the outcome of the appointment.
Well, Judge Ginsburg is doomed now, withdrawing. Do you feel that the incredible pressure that was brought to bear on him by Education Secretary Bennett and others to get out because of this, in effect, amounts to a railroading campaign?
Well, I think my own reaction is it's a bit hypocritical. I think the sort of high moralism of Secretary Bennett here is a bit distasteful to me personally. There isn't, I think, enough in this incident of his past occasional use of marijuana to reject the nomination or to force his withdrawal out of hand. I like President Reagan's attitude much better, which was expressed in terms of a certain sense of compassion for a mistake in the past. Secretary Bennett's not very compassionate and not very forgiving, and he represents a sort of hard edge of the administration in that regard. But if Judge Ginsburg withdraws, it'll be a personal tragedy for him. And I think in the interests of future appointments to government office, including the Supreme Court, this sort of incident should not be the determining incident. In the case of Judge Ginsburg, it should have been his judicial philosophy and his legal abilities. And
Whether
I'm
it's
sorry
the
if he doesn't go forward.
Whether it's the Supreme Court or the campaign trail, do you think that somehow we are looking for saints in our elected and appointed offices in this country?
Well, you can go to that extent. I mean, I sometimes think that if our great leaders of the past, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, even George Washington, were called before committees today and asked to justify their appointment to government office, they might be given a pretty rough time. That doesn't say that there aren't questions that are properly raised about someone's moral character and standards. That's obviously part of any political appointment to high office. But again, I think it's a matter of understanding that everybody's human. There are few saints among us, and it all should be taken in a proportion of what the office is, what the requirements are, and what the person's general background and abilities are.
Let's move on to the budget now, if we may. You are, of course, the chairman of the Budget Summit Committee. Let me ask you this. There is a well-publicized proposal that the Republicans have put on the table in the person of Representative Michael, which includes some $30 billion in deficit reduction for fiscal 88, $45 billion more for next year. It includes some $8 billion in new taxes for fiscal 88. Talks about $14 billion in spending cuts, domestic and defense. Mm-hmm. Is this something that the Democrats can and will buy onto? Is this the deal?
Well, we're going to be looking, all of us, Republicans and Democrats alike, at this suggestion, as well as others that have been advanced by Chairman Bill Gray of the Budget Committee and Chairman Childs of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Childs, and Senator Domenici. I don't think that the final agreement will center around any one individual package as presented by one of these members. I think it'll be a composite of agreements over taxes, spending cuts in both domestic programs and defense, entitlements and discretionary spending and so on. Certainly, Representative Michael's suggestion has been a positive one. We're going to be considering it early in this week, and there were some people who will feel that it needs more balance, something approximating the kind of revenue levels that it would equal spending levels, and the kinds of revenues that are involved will be important.
Well, now, does that mean that you and the Democrats in particular are still looking for more deficit reduction through more higher taxes?
Well, we started out with the idea, both Democrats and Republicans started out with the idea that there would be a matching of revenues for spending cuts. That was the original undertaking that we both had. In revenues, the administration includes both what we would call taxes, user fees like boat registration fees and so on, and finally asset sales, the sale of physical or fiscal assets of the government. In the spending cut side, we have both domestic and defense programs. The administration generally does not want to match any revenues against cuts in defense. The administration doesn't believe in cuts in defense. Members of both parties, however, I think in the Congress, feel that defense should pay a fair share of the deficit reduction burden. So we're having some difficulty putting a package together, and one of the things we agreed on at the early part of our negotiations is we wouldn't discuss in public the particular variations of any plan. In the case of Mr. Michael's plan, there was an immediate accidental leak of all of the details in general, and so it's become a matter of public discussion, sort of contrary to what is useful in terms of our discussions, because carrying on these discussions in public does not particularly help us reach agreement. But I would say that it's going to be a useful addition to the proposals on the table, and I think it'll be helpful in reaching a conclusion.
Well, we've been hearing now for 2 weeks that there might be an announcement of a deal sometime soon. How much still separates you? When are we going to hear a word of real progress and an agreement?
Well, I said at the beginning of the talks 2 weeks ago that I thought they would take most of 3 weeks at least. I said the deadline for us was the 20th of November, and the target amount was $24 billion. If we can do more, splendid. If we can do it sooner, fine.
Should cost of living increases on Social Security be included and be capped as part of it?
They're off the table. They've been off the table from the beginning, and they remain off the table.
How about a gas tax? There's a report today that the administration, the president, would accept a 5-cent a gallon tax on gasoline to help raise the revenues.
I think gas taxes are something that could be considered. I personally think that that's a possibility in terms of finding the kind of revenue we need.
And is that acceptable to the president and the Republicans at that time?
I don't know. We haven't really gotten into the specifics of any energy taxes. We've discussed them generally. We've discussed other kinds of revenues. The House passed a bill, a reconciliation bill, that included about $11 to $12 billion of revenues. And it included the retention of some kinds of taxes that are due for expiration now, like a 3% telephone tax and so on. I can't give you the precise result of these negotiations. I think in a reasonable time, perhaps that by the end of this coming week, we'll have the agreement, and I think that it will be important to note that it will be an agreement. The Congress and the President have already undertaken to provide for automatic spending cuts starting on the 20th of November if we don't have an alternative budget plan. I think the important thing about getting an agreement, however, is that it signals a bipartisanship and a spirit of cooperation between the administration and the Congress that in itself is valuable. What do you think the effect of such an agreement would be on the jittery nerves on Wall Street? Well, I hope they'd pay some attention to it, because there has been a series of disagreements over the budget, which has lasted many years now. The last sort of important agreement came in 1983 when we agreed on a Social Security package to strengthen that system.
Congressman, we're just about out of time. One more very, very quick response from you. Do you think Ronald Reagan is truly flexible now?
Well, I think the President realizes the seriousness of the problem, as does the Congress, and I predict that the budget negotiations will be able to reach an agreement. That agreement will be a bipartisan one. It'll be important in giving the clear signal that we intend to move downward on the deficit toward a balanced budget.
House Majority Leader Congressman Thomas Foley, thank you very much for being with us. And stay with us. When we come back, we'll talk with two budget experts. Welcome back to Newsmaker Saturday. With us now, former House Budget Committee Chairman James Jones and former Assistant Treasury Secretary Richard Darman. Thank you both for being with us. Gentlemen, we just heard House Majority Leader Foley say that the cost of living adjustments for Social Security are in fact off the table, that we will not apparently be seeing any cap to those cost of living adjustments in an effort to tame the deficit. Wise or not wise? You're both out of the process now, both of you being formers. You can tackle this political hot potato. Congressman?
Well, I think everything ought to be on the table. When I was budget chairman, I met with several of the retired groups, Social Security recipients, and I think the general feeling was if the problem's big enough, all of us are willing to participate in the solution, but everybody has to be treated alike. And I think if it were approached in that way, it would not be a big political problem.
What do you think?
I think it ought to be on the table, and I expect it may still get on the table. That's not to say it'll be part of an agreement, but I think it'll be discussed some more. I think that the markets would respond more favorably if they saw Social Security in the package, mainly because it's an indication that the politicians are actually willing to be serious, because there is a political cost in ever putting it on the table. In order to get anyone to agree to it, though, it has to be done in a way that no one can be blamed, and that's what's extremely tricky to manage because it's such a volatile issue.
So it's like we've got President Reagan and Congressman Foley, or whomever his counterpart would be, standing in front of an elevator, and they're each saying, no, 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 after you, and no one will take the first step?
Well, that goes back to 1981 when the first Reagan budget was set in, and some unfortunate cuts were made in Social Security affecting the lowest income level of the elderly population. And the Democrats tried to warn them, and then when they didn't listen, Democrats took advantage of that politically. And since then, everybody's been very touchy about the issue. I personally think, however, that if Social Security and all the other programs were treated alike, that the recipients would participate in that solution. And I just don't think that is a major problem. But I think Dick is right to this extent. It has to be done in a way that both parties and the leaders of both parties accept responsibility for it. Neither one can be blamed for saying we're going to cut here and because it's a political issue.
Mr. Darman, do you think, having been at the White House and having been at the Treasury, that no matter how it is staged, that President Reagan would manage to escape a rather harsh degree of criticism for going after Social Security when he's promised not to do that?
Well, that, as I said before, is the politically difficult thing. And I think it would probably be easier if there were some sort of buffer group, as there was in 1982 and 83 with a commission, where you could say it was the commission's responsibility. It's an awful lot more difficult in this context because in the end, somebody is going to be said to have been the one who first did it, and whoever that somebody is at risk politically.
To the extent that we know what is on the table now, with referring to the Michael plan, which we were talking about with Congressman Foley a short time ago, $30 billion in deficit savings over the first year, $45 billion the next year. What kind of signal would that be to Wall Street? Would it do the trick?
Well, in my judgment, you have to have something of that magnitude to do the trick for a long period of time. If they reach an agreement, yes, I think it'll give a brief respite to the jitters on Wall Street, but I think they need something more than $24 billion to really calm them down for a longer period of time.
I think Wall Street is already expecting something on the order of 25 to 30 billion in the first year and 45 to 50 in the second year. So the failure to produce that would have a negative effect. Actually producing it may not have that much of a positive effect. But even after it's done, there will still be a large structural deficit. And over the next 6 to 8 months, the markets are going to start to focus on the question, what's the next installment? And there'll be an additional problem to be addressed.
So you now really see not the $23 billion as the minimum, but the Michael plan as the minimum.
It seems to me likely that the Michael plan is going to be, in magnitude, roughly the settling point. I don't think it's going to get larger, but I also don't think it's going to get much smaller. It includes $5 billion or so in asset sales, I understand. And for them to get to $30 billion, they'll probably have to include asset sales on that order.
Now, there are new, of course, we've heard it, there are new taxes that are going to happen, excuse me, one way or the other. And there are cuts in defense that are going to happen, it would appear, one way or the other. Both of these indicate, and there are more domestic spending cuts that are going to happen one way or the other. All of this indicating some degree of new flexibility, not only on the part of the White House, but also on the part of the Democrats in Congress. Could this have been done absent a Wall Street crash, and why wasn't it, if you were in the Congress?
Well, I think one of the unfortunate byproducts of the Reagan administration is it has created the highest sense of partisanship that I've seen since 1961. And I think you cannot solve very difficult problems unless you have a sense of trust between the parties, or unless you have a clear understanding that if you don't solve them, that it's going to be calamitous for the country. And I think with the recovery over the period of 82 to 86, there was no sense of urgency, no political demand that you do something. There was that lack of trust between parties. So there was no sense of bipartisanship. Now with the stock market crash, I think there are jitters out there. Clearly the foreign investors are jittery. I think it's a golden opportunity for President Reagan to take a strong leadership position, to have a real summit where he gets a hands-on involvement in this, and I think he could really do something. Absent that, I think it's going to be something that the markets already expect.
Mr. Darman, the highest degree of partisanship since the early 60s? Is the Reagan administration guilty as charged?
I don't know that the blame is exclusively to be focused on the Reagan administration.
Where else would it be?
There's a wider degree of ideological difference than in the past. I think the mood at times has been very bipartisan. I referred to the 82-83 period on Social Security, where there was a bipartisan agreement. There have been several other important bipartisan agreements over this period. What was missing was that spirit of bipartisanship in 85 and 87. We've missed 2 installments in budget reduction in this period because the two branches haven't been cooperating. Graham-Ruddin was supposed to force cooperation, And unfortunately, what happened was Graham-Rudman was itself modified so that it wasn't such a strong forcing mechanism.
Well, the forcing mechanism for the last major bipartisan effort, the Social Security Act of 1983, was the fact that Social Security would be bankrupt that year unless something was done. That focused attention. With the recovery, nobody really focused on a problem. And now the stock market decline gives us that opportunity to know that that's a clear signal. This economy is in jeopardy, and both parties ought to be doing something about it.
Did this administration, the Reagan administration, in fact get a free ride out of this economic recovery?
I don't know exactly what you mean by that.
Well, in the sense of not coming to brass tacks terms with a deficit that we've been talking about in this town since it started ballooning in the early 80s.
Let me make a few points. One, we've had 59 straight months of growth. That's something that's to the good regardless. Two, the deficit, yes, ballooned and got up to almost 7% of gross national product. And now, though it's much too large, it's about half of that. It's down to about 3.5% of GNP. It's got to keep on coming down because what we've been doing has been essentially bridge financing our own debt by importing capital principally from Japan. That cannot go on forever. It's not prudent, and so we've got to get the deficit down further.
We only have about 30 seconds remaining. I would like to ask you both, if we see $30 billion in reduction this year, $45 billion in reduction next year, is it the beginning of the end of the budget deficit? Very fast.
No, I think the structural deficit is there, and we're going to be dealing with that into the 1990s.
I think there'll be a major bipartisan agreement in early 1989 in order to get at the rest of the problem.
Congressman Jones, Mr. Darman, thank you both very much for being with us today on Newsmaker Saturday.
If you would like to comment on this week's program, write to Newsmaker Saturday, care of CNN, Post Office Box 2063, Washington, D.C. 20013.
Follow the leader into the future of television. CNN, the world's most important network.